Hello Neuromaniacs, welcome to part 3 of my video on cranial nerves 7, 8 and 9, the facial, the vestibulocochlear and the glossopharyngeal nerves. Check out my channel Neuromaniac for parts 1 and 2 where I discuss cranial nerves 1 through to 6. Stay tuned for the rest of the video and hit the subscribe button down below. Let's get started. Cranial nerve number 7, the facial nerve, has roots which originates from 3 nuclei of the pons region. These are known as a solitary nucleus for the taste sensation, the facial motor nucleus for facial expressions, and the salivatory nucleus for the parasympathetic process of salivation. The sensory and parasympathetic roots are paired together and commonly known as the intermediate nerve. It's important to note the facial nerve emerges from the pontine medullary junction as shown here. It then travels through the internal auditory meatus located in the petrous part of the temporal bone. The nerve then travels through the internal acoustic canal, otherwise known as the intracranial path, until it reaches a point called the geniculate ganglion. An intracranial branch that arises from this ganglion is the greater petrosal nerve, which innervates the lacrimal gland, in simpler terms, the tear gland. From this ganglion, the nerve descends into the middle ear cavity and branches off into a few more intracranial nerves. One of them is the stapedius nerve, which innervates the stapedius muscle. This muscle helps dampen vibrations in the inner ear. The next branch is the quarter tympani branch, which supplies the submandibular and sublingual salivary gland, as well as carry taste sensations from the anterior 2/3 of a tongue. Once the nerve reaches the stylomastoid foramen, it exits the cranium leading to 8 extracranial branches. First up is the posterior auricular branch, which innervates some scalp muscles around the ear. Second is to the posterior belly of the digastric muscle, which assists with extension of the head and jaw opening for speech and chewing. Third is the stylohyaloid branch, which innervates the mastoid muscle for swallowing. The last 5 major branches emerge from the parotid gland, and they are the temporal, zygomatic, buccal, marginal mandibular, and cervical branches. They are all responsible for the innervation of facial muscles. The temporal branch innervates the frontalis, orbicularis oculi, and corrugator supercilii. The zygomatic branch innervates the orbicularis oculi. The buccal branch innervates the orbicularis oris, the buccinator, and the zygomaticus muscles. The marginal mandibular branch innervates the mentalis muscle, and lastly the cervical branch innervates the platysma. Personally, the facial nerve was the most complex to study, but I found a mind map online which summarizes this nerve with a perfect amount of detail. I'll leave the credits and the link to this diagram in the description box below. Exam time. Question 12. Which branch of the facial nerve innervates these muscles? I hope you hit the pause button a few slides ago, but here are the answers. Question 13. Name all the intracranial branches of the facial nerve. Here they are. Question 14. Which foramen do the extracranial nerves exit? The answer is the stylomastoid foramen. Moving on to the 8th cranial nerve, the vestibulocochlear. The nerve is purely sensory and has 2 roots which are given in its name, the vestibular root and the cochlear root. The cochlear nerve fibers synapse on the spiral ganglion, where it receives information from the hair cells of organ of Corti. This is a structure within the cochlea that responds to vibrations caused by sound waves. On the other hand, the vestibular nerve fibers synapse on the vestibular ganglion, which receives information from the hair cells of semicircular canals, utricle, and saccule. The saccule detects movements of the head up and down, otherwise known as vertical acceleration, whereas the utricle responds to horizontal acceleration. In other words, movements of the head either left or right. Lastly, the semicircular canals respond to rotational movements. Now that we've discussed the branches, we should note the branches merge in the inner ear to form the vestibulocochlear nerve, and enter the petrous part of the temporal bone of the posterior cranial fossa via the internal acoustic meatus. From the posterior cranial fossa, the nerve enters the brainstem at the pontomedullary junction. It then travels a bit further where the auditory fibers synapse on the cochlear nucleus and the vestibular fibers synapse on the vestibular nuclear complex. Lastly, the function. The cochlear component is responsible for hearing, whereas the vestibular nerve is responsible for balance. Question 15. What is the difference between proprioception and vestibular sense? I haven't really gone into this, but I do think it's a relevant question, especially in exams. So here are some of my points that I think distinguish between the two. Take some time to absorb this in before moving on to the next question. Question 16. Select the correct classification of the vestibulocochlear nerve. That's correct. It's the special somatic efferent. If you find this confusing to remember, here are some handy tips in the yellow box. It'll make a world of difference. Question 17. What is the name of a structure labeled here? It's a simple one, but I'm just checking to make sure you're paying attention. You better rewind if you didn't say the cochlear nerve. Last nerve to be discussed today is the glossopharyngeal nerve. This nerve contains multiple types of fibers, which includes parasympathetic fibers from the inferior salivatory nucleus, the motor fibers from the ambiguous nucleus, and the visceral or chemosensory fibers from the solitary nucleus. These nuclei are all located in the medulla region, except for the salivatory nucleus. From the brainstem, the nerve travels laterally and exits the cranium via the jugular foramen. It then travels to the neck, ear, and posterior mouth region as shown here. There are actually 6 branches of the glossopharyngeal nerve, which I'll briefly summarize next. First is the tympanic nerve, also known as Jacobson's nerve. This nerve has sensory fibers which innervate the eardrum and eustachian tube. But the nerve also contains parasympathetic fibers which synapse at the parotid gland for salivation. The next branch is the stylopharyngeal nerve. This branch provides motor fibers to the stylopharyngeus muscle. Innervation of this muscle causes the larynx and pharynx to elevate, which enables the motion of swallowing. Next is the tonsillar branch, which carries sensory information from the palatine tonsil. The fourth branch is the lingual branch, which provides sensory innervation from the posterior 1/3 of the tongue for taste. The fifth branch is the nerve to the carotid sinus and carotid body. The nerve carries sensory information about blood pressure and carbon dioxide saturation sensed from the baroreceptors and chemoreceptors respectively. The last branch, the pharyngeal, innervates the pharyngeal plexus, which assists with swallowing by innervating the pharynx. Question 18. I hope you memorized like I said, but can you name the 6 branches of the glossopharyngeal nerve? I hope you're listening, but here they are again. Question 19. What type of fibers carry taste information from the tongue? Remember, this question is specific to the glossopharyngeal nerve, so the answer is special visceral sensory or special visceral afferent nerve fibers. Thank you for watching part 3. Stay tuned for the cranial nerve finale. Show some love by hitting the subscribe button and the like button too. Come on, what are you waiting for?